Hello.
Hi.
Welcome. I'm glad you're joining us on YouTube. This is a continuation of Old Cambridge Baptist Church's Lenten exploration of the theme of grief and mourning and lament. And what we're doing here is in place of our in-person Thursday evening gatherings, which began a few weeks ago with one in-person gathering before we had to stop those for physical distancing in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're uploading the rest of the content of those Thursday sessions onto this YouTube page so that you can continue this exploration together. Our first session was with Kevin Hinsey, who led us through a really caring conversation about suicide and grief following suicide. Last week you saw a YouTube video that involved Holly White interviewing me about narrative resources for grief. And today we have the Reverend Jenny Stuart, who is an ordained UCC minister and licensed social worker who works in private practice doing psychotherapy. And I'm really happy to have you in this space.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Jenny is going to be helping us think through another concern of grief and grieving that doesn't get brought into conversation very often. And so that's sort of the overall purpose of these conversations, is to highlight ways that we experience grief and loss that don't often get talked about in caring community. So Jenny's going to be talking with us about traumatic forms of loss and the grief that attends those losses. So a bit of a content warning here is that we will talk about traumatic forms of loss and death and grief. And if that seems like something that would be hard for you to experience in this disembodied form by watching it on YouTube, then feel free to stop the video here. I know that this is something that some folks would rather talk about with someone in the room with them who is an embodied presence. So just to state that up front in case you decide you don't want to watch this video. But for those who do, I'm really glad that you're joining in this continuation of our exploration of grief and mourning and lament. Thank you, Jenny, for leading us through this part of it.
Yes, thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah.
Should I just start off?
Why don't you tell us something about what it means to talk about traumatic grief and what might qualify as a traumatic form of loss that fits into this category of grief and grieving that you probably address on a regular basis in your practice.
Yes, and in fact, there's a lot of terms that are used to define the scope: traumatic loss, traumatic grief, traumatic death, traumatic bereavement. So it all is pretty much the same thing. But I would say that traumatic loss or traumatic grief happens when there's a sudden and unexpected death, and often that death is a result of violent means or it was a very terrible accident. I think even Kevin's topic of suicide also would fall in that scope too. And I think it's a relatively new way of thinking about traumatic grief, traumatic death, is that it combines two different fields. It combines the field of traumatology, and the field of death and dying immunology. So starting to look at how those uniquely come together.
And as much as this is a particular form of grief that is now garnering attention in its own kind of way, it is not really an unusual form of grief in the sense that a lot of us, in the course of our lives, experience the traumatic loss of someone that we love, or the traumatic loss of some part of our own physical abilities or something of that sort. And the field of traumatology has become such an important field in psychotherapeutic theory and in theology these days. It's a really keen interest. So I think that is some evidence that this form of grief and loss is gaining more attention among professionals than it has in the past, even though it's not a very out of the ordinary form of loss at all.
That's very true. Very true. I'm reminded of Paul Tillich, who talked about grief and noted that often loss and terrible things that happen are part of the human condition, and they're part of the human condition for all time. So that in a way we live in two different times. We live in our historical time, but then there's this overarching humanity time in which we're all bound together in that. And particularly given the time of year, with the approach of Holy Week, Holy Saturday.
That's a really important point, that at the heart of the Christian tradition is a traumatic death.
Yeah, that is interesting. I agree. And so important and so vital, and for me, the crux of Christianity, that Jesus is willing and able and does go into the very darkest spaces of our human experience, and there's no hell that he does not know. And that gives me a lot of peace. And then thinking about Job, Job is sitting on his pile of ashes, and he's lost everything: his status, his family, his well-being, his friends, and he laments being alive. And I think that's not an unusual human experience. I think when there is a loss that results in enormous pain, the idea of living without that person is awful. And I love this quote from Job, this Job's lament, that he says, "I am not at ease, nor am I quiet, and I am not at rest, but turmoil comes." And I think
that's a really profound statement of grief, and a really poignant lament that these laments run throughout the Christian and Jewish tradition, certainly throughout the Hebrew Bible, but even into the New Testament. And some of Jesus' own words as he weeps over Jerusalem and laments the fact that peace is nowhere to be found there, and his own sense of impending loss, trauma. Can you tell us some maybe about how people experience traumatic losses that might be a bit different from the experience of the loss of someone that's sort of expected and peaceful, and still very difficult to lose someone we love, but not losing them in a very traumatic or jarring way? What are some of the things that come up for people after a really traumatic loss?
Right, that's an important distinction. I was thinking, actually, as I was walking over here, of some of the deaths I've been a part of through hospice, and how many of them were very beautiful. A man or a woman had lived a full life, and the generations were surrounding the bedside, and people were weeping, but they were mourning, and it had been, it was the end of a full and rich life, and there were songs and stories and a little bit of laughter, and so that that felt like a good death. But I think the unexpected sudden traumatic loss, for instance, I've worked with a mother who lost her 20-year-old son in an accident that happened over a college spring break, and she's married and she has 2 younger children, and the impact on her and the family in general is their lives are changed forever. Everything had to be reconstituted. What friendships were important. Her son was very involved in hockey and in the community, and she couldn't go to grocery stores anymore. She couldn't hang out in public spaces. It took her a while to get back to work. But even how the events unwind, I think immediately after learning of the death, what happens. For instance, if you get the call in your home, you remember the phone call, You remember what your spouse said. In this case, she remembers her husband saying, "You please don't tell me my son is dead." And then driving there and to the city where the accident happened, and then the saying goodbye and being in the hotel room and having to drive back. Yeah, I think the layers of trauma in these situations are really important to keep in mind, so that it's not just the event, it's people's reaction to the event. It's everything.
Yeah, I mean, as you're describing this, as I do in a lot of cases where I'm talking with other people who are in care and counseling kinds of roles, I often interpret what I'm hearing through the narrative lens that I most often deal with. And, it seems like the death of a loved one after many years of life in a hospice situation or at home or something like that is a narrative that one has already formed. Like, you can incorporate that story of the impending death into your imagination of what's going to happen with that person in your relationship with them. But with such a sudden and traumatic loss, it's almost, it brings to mind this phrase that Arthur Frank uses, a narrative sociologist, he talks about narrative ambush, and how the narratives we have about our life and how they're going to play out and how our loved ones' lives are going to play out are suddenly ambushed by an entirely divergent reality that is very difficult to incorporate into how we thought life was going to live out.
Yes.
Maybe the loss of a child is certainly one of those that parents don't have that incorporated into their sense of how life should go, how the story of their life should go.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a mourning of not just losing the child, but losing that future story. And I think one of the things that keeps coming back to this mother is, I just get so sad that my son will never get to experience having children or working or what his 20s will be like. And that's very painful.
Yeah. Thomas Lynch, who's a funeral director and American poet, I remember reading something from him one time about the experience of helping parents who lost babies, and he talked about how, I won't get his beautiful words exactly right. This is from his book, The Undertaking, where he talks about when we bury adults, we're burying our, pieces of our hopes and relationships with them. But when we bury babies, we're burying our future. We're burying our hope for the future, which I think is the case with children at any age, not just babies. Yeah. So what, I'm really curious from your perspective as someone who provides care and counseling, psychotherapy with people, what resources we have available to us to move through those experiences of traumatic loss, narrative ambush, and the loss of futures and hopes that we held close to us. I think we all have resources that are sort of available to us, but they're hard to access in those times.
I think that's true. I think in those immediate, what I've heard from many people and in my own experience, I think that those first weeks are sort of a blur. And maybe that needs to happen, just sitting with the emotion. For instance, this mother I work with, she doesn't remember anything that happened. She just knows people were wandering around her house and cleaning up and that kind of thing. But I think one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is this and maybe this speaks to the narrative part, is that this recommitment to time, or this investment with time, so that you've lost all of this, and now your life is going to be this. What is there that can help you move forward, move forward, such as the 2 younger children. That was a huge factor. A desire to just be in the world and be alive, and reconfigure what is joy. What can joy look like? Can there be joy again? Can I laugh again? Is it okay? It's it's sort of deciding, okay, this is what I have been given, like Job in a way, and then, but these are the choices I have. And sometimes that doesn't take away the grief or the pain, but sometimes that can help reset that narrative.
Something recovering some sense of agency in
Yes.
your life that is seemingly gone at that
Right.
moment. I'm really intrigued by this notion. I've never quite thought about it in these terms, this notion of how a traumatic loss disrupts time for a person.
Yeah.
And how in the description of this mother, it sounds like time was, for a period of weeks, time was at a standstill.
Yeah.
That nothing happened in those weeks that she even really remembers other than things happening around her,
Yeah.
but that she wasn't engaged in that time, and
Yeah.
in the same way that she might have been in following weeks when she
Yeah.
was able to hold on to some pieces of agency in her life again.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think dissociation happens in some cases where it's just so much for the body to take in, and you even experience shock.
Yeah.
And I know one woman found her mother after she had committed suicide, and it took her a long time to remember that that had happened.
Yeah. And those are protective
Yeah.
ways that our brain
For sure.
operates to keep us from,
Yeah.
or to keep us going. And I
Yeah.
think we can all relate to dissociation if we just think about the ways that sometimes we're driving down the interstate and we completely don't really remember like the last 10 miles where we get off at our exit and we don't have any real memory. Or you're on the train and suddenly you're completely zoned out, but somehow you know how to get off at the right stop.
Yeah.
So taking that little kernel of recognition of what dissociation is like and then expanding it into like a 2-week period of time when you aren't completely in agential control of even what's happening in your life. And your brain is protecting you in some ways, but it's also part of the overall trauma that you're experiencing.
Right. And then the work begins to get through that dissociation and start to integrate it into your life story. And I don't know if we ever make peace with it. I don't know if it's just about acceptance. I don't really know. I think healing looks different for different people. I also think that death can be traumatic if a person experiences it with symptoms of PTSD. So.
You mean any death?
Any death. But if you start, yes, exactly. It can raise a lot, I think.
So if we were in a room full of people right now talking about this, are there ways that you would invite us into conversation with you with any kind of prompts or questions that you might want us to deal with alongside you? Because folks will have the opportunity later on to engage in conversation either on a Zoom call or on a discussion site that we have set up during this period of physical distancing. So it might give us something to talk about in those formats.
Well, let's see. How about, would it be okay if I just read some quotes?
That'd be great.
And maybe that could get us thinking. So one thing, one young woman I work with pointed out to me recently. She said, "Did you know that the heart changes shape when there is a grief, or when grief happens? That it is in fact possible to die of a broken heart?" And she lost 2 siblings in a period of 8 years. And I think that's helpful. Indeed, the heart does change shape. and it's sort of the landscape, our lives, the depth, everything changes. Let me just, I'm going to have to turn to my the oldie but goodie Proverbs of Ashes. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, before you did that, that notion of the heart changing shape, I mean, in some ways that's metaphorical, but in other ways, I mean, there is a really important recognition of how we hold all of our experiences, but traumatic experiences in our body.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the reason why certain forms of therapy like EMDR, high movement desensitization reprocessing, works because it's an embodied form. And I think about Bessel van der Kolk's newest book, The Body Keeps the Score, and things of that nature. That these things are embodied experiences more than we often recognize, because we have for so long in Western Enlightenment traditions separated mind and body, when in reality they're an integrated whole.
Yeah, definitely. Trauma is experienced with the entire body, for sure. Particularly when, obviously, as you know, the nervous system is engaged, and yeah, so.
And so you're going to get to Proverbs of Ashes, which is a book that was really formative to me about 10 or 12 years ago, and I really love this text. And so just for folks who are watching, this is Rita Nakashima-Brock and Rebecca Ann Parker, a book called Proverbs of Ashes, and I highly recommend that you look it up and find a copy. It's a really readable and very profound theological text that is written by these two, superstar feminist theologians. I couldn't recommend this book highly enough. It sounds like you are particularly.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
Please share with us about that.
It has really, the book has really meant a lot to me in terms of thinking about faith and trauma, and the presence of God and God without. But here, so they write, grief is never overcome or removed, but remains part of living. To yearn for the return of the ones who technical difficulties.
Yeah. Let's see if this is.
Okay.
Can we talk a little bit about the notion from Rebecca Parker and Rita Nakashima-Brock about love being as strong as death?
Yeah, as opposed to love is stronger than death.
Which is how I heard it first.
Yeah.
That they say love
is as strong as death.
Death.
Right. I think about that a lot. And it will be great to have a dialogue with that, to hear other people's feedback about that. But I actually do believe, that love is stronger than death. I don't know if that's what I want to believe, or if it's real. I am always moved by what happened with my friends and the loss of the daughter. Just was extraordinary. But I think in thinking about Brock and Parker, I think they're honoring the horror of the loss or the happening or the violence of it.
Yeah.
And so they're not wanting to make it like love can definitely overcome that. I think it's more love can help you through it. But it doesn't erase what happened.
That's a really critical distinction, I think, because a lot of times these phrases that we use make it sound like whatever the good thing is just going to erase the bad thing, the painful thing, but that still exists alongside the power of love, and particularly love practiced in community. That's really a helpful distinction. I'm really appreciative of those words. Because I'm not exactly sure that the sound picked up very well, can we revisit the witnessing piece of it?
Okay.
Could you just read that quote one more time?
Yes, I can. Salvation begins with the courage of witnesses whose gaze is steady. There's a lot there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Salvation begins.
You know, with the technical difficulties, you've read this a couple times now.
Yeah.
Every time I hear something different, like whose gaze is steady.
Right.
I didn't hear that before.
Yeah, interesting. I have to say, I didn't hear the courage with the courage.
Mm.
So salvation begins with the courage of witnesses
Yeah.
whose gaze is steady.
Can you say something about how, I think in a lot of cases we feel rather helpless in relation to witnessing other people's traumatic pain and grief, but that is a really critical part of care. Can you say something more about what it means to be a courageous and steady witness for people in the midst of this kind of loss?
I think it does take it does take some work of self, because it's scary to understand that these things can happen. And so I think when we are accompanying those who have experienced very hard and awful things, we have to be able to go there with them. I think we have to be able to accept that this is part of the human condition. And we can't, I think it doesn't help to be pitying or to say, oh my God, I can't believe that happened to you. That really is not helpful. I think it's more just, this kind of calm presence.
Yeah, that is in itself a healing act.
Yeah.
And we thought earlier about the book of Job, and when his friends were with him, it was being with him in silence that was the most profoundly helpful. And when they began to speak, it was when things got a little tense, and they theologized in ways that weren't helpful for Job to hear, which is what we do in very many cases when we need to help make sense of a situation that doesn't make sense. Which I think is a really critical part of trauma. It is an experience out of which our minds cannot quite make sense in that moment. And the presence of witnesses to that event, rather than theologizing about it or trying to make people feel better. The other piece of it I think is really critical when I hear you talk about this notion of courage and the steadiness of witness is not assuming that someone else's timeline of grief is going to be the same as yours, even if you've experienced something very similar, and that in reality there are no fixed timelines, that these are patterns of experience that are unique in some sense, and to be able to honor that uniqueness as a person moves through their grief, and not rush them, and not presume you know where they should be going, and things like that.
Right. I think that's beautifully said. I think also, though, that experience that you have had, if it is similar, can be used as a deeper presence. You understand. You have been through it. And they don't need you to define it for them or to tell them what it should be, but the fact that you know the depth of the pain, that you understand.
They're not completely alone in that experience.
Exactly.
Even though it is their experience uniquely, but there are others who have also experienced something similar and survived, found ways of claiming agency in their life again. And it increases our empathic presence in a lot of ways if we allow it to inform how we are being with other people in that.
I do think that standing with and being seen is such a healing piece, and I think that's the salvation begins. And I know that Rebecca Parker, one of the authors of Proverbs, of course, has a history of sexual abuse, and she, and there may have been another assault that happened, I'm not sure, but she gives the example of how she and her friends came together to witness what had happened to her. And I think they all held candles It was just like a healing kind of protest, acknowledgement. I think we can handle most things if there is love and companionship and understanding. I think it's when we're not heard, we're not seen, we feel invisible or alone. That is a potentially very terrible despair.
Yeah. And made so much more pressing and important in this time. We are all physically distancing ourselves from one another in the midst of a pandemic.
Yeah.
To remember and creatively practice that togetherness and that love and community when we can't necessarily be together in community in the same space and in a number.
That's a loss for sure.
Yeah.
Scary.
And it's a loss that will be experienced by many as traumatic. I mean, it's in many ways that people are already losing loved ones.
Yeah.
And even this week, I've heard from family and from congregants who have loved ones who are in other cities around the country who are in the ICU with really difficult circumstances related to COVID-19. One person who reached out today and said that they had lost a family friend already to the virus. So, this is, even though we, of course, didn't plan it this way, this conversation is taking place in a time when we really need to think about what it means to practice community around the experience of traumatic loss. And even beyond the deaths that we experience, the loss that others are experiencing in relation to how important community is to them, and the physicality of that community is resurfacing traumas for people that they
have experienced in the past where it's triggering.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the women who stood at the foot of the cross as Jesus was suffering and did not move, and just how crucial that was.
And I can't remember, there was something you read about relationship, I think, from that, or either you said, and it might have been earlier, another take or something, but about how relationships change in relation to trauma. And how even our relationship to the divine changes. Was that quote from the...
So that was one of the, we did some, it was one of the questions for reflection.
Oh, from the handout, right, that's right. Will you read those questions for reflection? These are things that I hope that we can discuss in some of our online formats following up to this video.
Cool. Okay, questions for reflection. How and what is your relationship with God in the aftermath of loss? Where do you find meaning when all there is ash and pain? Where does your soul find solace?
All really profound questions that take a lot of introspective thought and reflection. The one that I was thinking about having heard was that one about how our relationship with God changes in relationship to traumatic experiences. And how, at least in the experiences I've had caring for people in the midst of trauma, long-term relationships change in that context. Relationships to your loved ones, relationships to spouses who've lost children, but that relationship to our sense of the holy, the divine, the context of ultimacy in which we live, that changes and doesn't get quite as much attention oftentimes. I mean, it happened for Job, throughout the book of Job, how Job's relationship to God changed. And I even think about, you talk about the woman at the foot of the cross, I think about Jesus' relationship to God changing in that moment when he was able to utter the cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? That wasn't something he had expressed before in the Gospels. It was in that moment of traumatic pain and impending death. I do not think we should take as a rhetorical device, but as an expression of his relationship to God in that moment changing in some way.
Right, that's lovely. Yeah, that wrestling with God, and that movement of Jesus going to hell. You know, there's nothing that Jesus does not understand or comprehend, and I think that God can hold all of our questions, anger, terror.
And I think about the really rich tradition among Jewish survivors of the Holocaust and Jewish theologians who have done theology in relation to the Holocaust being a really prime exemplar of that reflection on one's relationship with God in the light of trauma or in the shadows of trauma. Elie Wiesel and others who bring God into the midst of the trauma and death and don't let God off the hook relationally in the midst of that trauma.
And that is a deep complexity. Because that involves spirit, soul. You know, getting back to God is not easy. At the same time, hanging on to God can be life-saving.
And that movement of distancing and drawing close can also just be a very long-term movement of, you know, that moment, a pronounced period of distancing from the divine may even be a very healthy, healing part of one's going through the experience of trauma and what that is doing in relationship to your connection to the divine.
The walk through the wilderness, spiritual growth.
Thank you for having this conversation.
Thank you.
I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
And I hope that there'll be ways for us to converse together about this material going forward in online formats and maybe in other ways as well. So I just want to say for those who are joining during this time of this physical distancing and not being able to gather together in any number in community, the community is really important. And if you are listening to this and feeling distanced from your community in ways that would be helpful for you to have some even virtual connections, then you can reach me at pastor@oldcambridgebaptist.org. And I'll be really happy to help you connect with community in the coming days. So until we are able to get back together again in person, I wish you well, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Blessings.